Hi, everyone. I'm here with Noam Chomsky today. Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us. I have a couple questions on indigenous and sort of reconciliation I'd like to go through. Um, but yeah, thanks once again.
Very glad to be with you.
So my first question is about the place Native Americans hold in the American consciousness. I thought I'd ask just where we are in the American consciousness. I draw this question from Angela Davis, talks about slavery and the genocide of Native Americans as being a nightmare America wants to forget. So I was kind of like interested in your thoughts on genocide and American history and things like that.
Well, one thing we can say is there's improvement, much belated. So when I was a kid, early in the 1930s, came from a left liberal family environment. My friends and I would be running around in the woods. Parents wouldn't let us have guns, but we made them out of twigs. We were playing cowboys and Indians. Okay, that was a left liberal family in the early 30s. Well, fortunately, I mean, my children couldn't have dreamt of doing anything like that, let alone my grandchildren. It's gone. And it's changed for a lot of the public. Very slow, hundreds of years too late. In the scholarly world, you go back to the 1960s. I was already a young faculty member. You read the major American historians. They were telling you that an anthropologist, the leading anthropologists, were saying there were maybe a couple 100,000 Indians straggling around in North America. Didn't amount to much. Fortunately, we were able to take care of them and let our great civilization grow. Well, this was broken by Francis Jennings, actually, not in the academic world. He was the curator of a museum, wrote a great book, must have been late 60s sometime, called, I think, The Invasion of America or something like that, which began to set the story straight. Not everything, but he had it basically accurate. And it went on from there. By now, there's an extensive scholarship digging up the hideous record of extermination, as the founding fathers called it. By now, it's beginning to be understood that the main reason for the American Revolution was that the British had imposed restrictions on the colonists, not permitting them to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. And of course, the settlers just wanted to go on and take everything. They'd already taken quite a lot. Where I was living in Boston, everything, Uh, but they wanted to go on, and the great speculators like George Washington wanted to make money by speculating on land. The British had insisted there was a royal proclamation of 1763, which said that the colonists cannot encroach on the Indian nations and their lands. They didn't want that. That was probably the main reason for the revolution, not the Tea Party. Of course, as soon as even before the war was over, Washington had launched a war against the Iroquois, among whom he was known as the town destroyer. Then, as soon as the British were gone, they teamed across, and don't have to run through the rest of the story, but which is by now pretty well documented, up through the final act of, by now, what is generally called genocide in California in the latter part of the 19th century. The history of violence, terror, extermination, breaking of treaties, just monstrous acts. That's the main legacy of the country. You can now read it in academic scholarship or in excellent work like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, on her people's history of America from indigenous peoples. It's seeping into general consciousness. You probably saw that just a couple of days ago, the Cleveland Indians finally agreed to change the name. In fact, what's being done is astonishing. I've wrote about it. I could give you some examples of things I wrote about if you're interested. Just
Sure, yeah.
about 40 years ago, I used to go for the, I lived in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And over the summer, my family and I would rent a cottage for a couple of weeks out on Cape Cod. Cape Cod is, this is liberal America, liberal professionals from Boston mainly, going there for a couple of weeks in the summer. I was walking with some friends down a path in the national forest there, and there was a little clearing on the side. I walked over to see what it was. It was just clear away the clearing. You could see a plaque on the ground. The plaque said, I am a Wampanoag woman. I and my family gave of ourselves and our lands so that this great country could grow and flourish. There must have been thousands of people walking past that. Nobody ever noticed it or saw anything wrong with it. This is probably the 1960s, 70s. Well, I did write about it and say how disgusting it is. I don't know if that had an effect or something else had an effect, but I went back about 10 years ago, and the plaque was surrounded by flowers, by notes saying how horrible it was and so on. Kind of sign of what's going on. There are other things. About 10 or 15 years ago, I wrote something about how we would feel if the Nazi Air Force used the names of, if they had a airplane called Kikes, or an airplane called Jew Bastards or something like that. That's what we do. Tomahawk missiles, Apaches. We name our weapons after people we've exterminated. Well, got a lot of angry letters after it, but I don't know if this, I think nobody didn't catch on. Nobody sees anything wrong with that. Nevertheless, there is progress. It's very different from what it was in the past. It's got a long way to go, but I think we're finally moving.
That's
There are
good to
major
hear.
issues, like right where I am, there happens to be I'm in Arizona now, happens to be a sacred mountain of the Apaches where they put up an observatory and it blocks the path up to the mountain. And there's a conflict going on, but at least there's a conflict. You go back 20 or 30 years, nobody would have even understood the issue. Okay, that's progress.
Yeah, so that's encouraging to hear. Very
You know the
slow.
story of the Wampanoag language, I suppose. But
Uh,
that's a spectacular story. In the eastern Massachusetts, where I grew up, the Wampanoag were one of the major tribes, wiped out, basically. Almost. There's a residue, small reservations. A couple of years ago, one of my colleagues, a great anthropological linguist, Ken Hale, died recently. Marvelous guy who was working on indigenous people's rights in Australia, the United States, Central America. He found a member of the Wampanoag tribe, a woman named Jessie Little. She was interested that the language hadn't been spoken for 100 years. She was interested in studying linguistics. The two of them got together. They used comparative evidence from other Indian languages, missionary texts. They were able to basically reconstruct the language. And now it has its first native speaker in 100 years. Jessie Littledoe's daughter. It's revitalized the tribe. A lot of people are interested. They're learning it. Revitalized the culture, a lot of engagement. Instead of just sitting off in a corner of Massachusetts, the tribe is actually doing things. Well, it's a kind of thing that can be done and is being done in one or another way. So it's very late. Extermination has taken place, not 100%, but there's finally the beginnings of recognition of these horrendous atrocities. Not entirely. I'll give you an example to the contrary. Take the New York Review of Books. That's the main intellectual journal of the liberal left in the English-speaking world, major one. A couple of years ago, it had an article by a good left liberal columnist who was reviewing a book by Edmund Morgan, a famous American historian. And he started off by saying how astonished he was to learn. He learned a lot of things from the book. For example, he learned that when the colonists came to the Western Hemisphere, there were about 1 million people here, from the tropical forests to the icy lands in the north. In other words, the whole hemisphere. He's off by about 80 million. And they weren't straggling around. They had advanced cultures, at least as advanced as the colonists, except for guns. They had major cities, commercial centers, remarkable agricultural plantations and installations in Bolivia in the north. By now it's sort of known. There's an important book called 1492, which goes through, maybe it's called 1491, which describes what the advanced cultures and societies before the colonists came and the invaders came and destroyed everything. Well, it's now coming out, but nevertheless, in the New York Review, you could still have this article. I checked for a couple of months to see if anybody would say anything about it. Not a single letter, at least none that were published. The review obviously was under some pressures, because 4 months afterwards, they published a small correction, which was almost as bad as the original. No comments after that. Well, that's the left liberal extreme, the most progressive end of the mainstream. Means there's a long way to go.
That's great. It's great to know it's going in a good direction. The elders tell us a lot. We don't fall on the same political spectrum. So they say the left wing, right wing is the same bird. Don't forget that. So keep our worldview. Thinking about language, I'm thinking about the importance. You kind of touched on this in the Wampanoag story. How important are indigenous languages to be kept alive in those worldviews?
It's just like asking whether French and German and English should be kept alive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the language isn't just words. It's a repository of cultural wealth, oral history, consciousness of a group consciousness, awareness of ways of understanding the world, understanding yourself. And if you wipe it out, it's like wiping out a species. And that's why there is one of the good things in the recent years is major efforts to protect languages that are at risk and to revive those that where there's very few or no speakers. There is, in fact, an endangered language fund, operates in New Haven, Connecticut, sort of in connection with Yale University, which coordinates these efforts around the world. Should mention, incidentally, it's not just indigenous languages.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take a country, I mean, national languages are pretty recent, even very recent, in fact. Take Italy. Right now, there are hundreds of languages disappearing. There are plenty of people in Italy who can't talk to their grandmother because they speak something called an Italian dialect, which is actually a totally different language, not mutually intelligible. As national unity is imposed and a national state is imposed, you tend to get one of the many dialects predominating and it becomes the national language. It's just now happening in Italy. You go back a generation, it was just happening in Germany. Actually, I had a graduate student in 1970 who was studying Germanic linguistics, and he wanted to go to Germany to live and work after he graduated. So he managed to get a job in Cologne. His job was teaching German to German students. The
Wow.
point is, their own language was so different from official German that they had to learn it as a second language. That actually takes place in even in the United States.
Mm.
I remember a couple of years ago giving a talk at Eastern Kentucky University. When I walked around the streets, I could barely understand what people were saying. At the college, there are courses, or there were at that time, maybe still, teaching students standard English so they could get a job at IBM or something like that.
Mm.
You walk around the streets of Glasgow, you can barely understand what people are saying. I mean, national languages coalesce late in the stage of national development.
Mm-hmm.
And nation states are pretty recent developments. So in fact, there's enormous destruction of languages taking place all around the world. Many of them are just coalescing into a single national language. In Italian, in Italy, happens to be the dialect of Florence. That's what television is, what education is, and so on. So that's the language of the younger generation. But and among the indigenous languages, it just disappears. And in fact, it's not just the languages, it's the societies. Take a look at what's happening right now in Brazil. The president, I mean, there's enormous number of indigenous languages throughout the whole Amazonian region. They're under not just the languages, the societies are under severe threat, partly just the destruction of the Amazon, partly the policies of the government. President Bolsonaro has said that the indigenous people in the indigenous population have no right to a square meter of land. They should just join the general society. He says that's what they want anyway. They want cell phones and jobs at McDonald's and so on. So we should save them from their bitter fate of living their own lives in their own communities, and we should force them into our society, where they'll be, of course, at the lower rungs of the society. Well, that's happening right now before our eyes in Brazil. So it's not a historical issue.
Yeah, there is that idea, nationalism wanting to bring every distinct group into the people politic, like sort of like assimilation. Well, it is assimilation, yeah.
Incidentally, now it's a disaster and for many of the First Nations because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all the way from Canada down to Chile, indigenous people are often in places where there isn't a hospital anywhere nearby.
Mm-hmm.
Brazil, you may have to take a boat hours of trips to get to a place where there's medical aid. So people are dying. It's happening in Canada all the way. That's the conditions in which indigenous people have been compelled to live means that they're extremely vulnerable to serious diseases.
Mhm. I'd like to ask also about public relations in terms of I work at a university, but I'm thinking in general propaganda and PR and how they're linked. I know you talk extensively about this, but just for my students, a little something on the power of creating manufacturing consent, as you put it.
Well, there have been centuries of manufacture of consent to the point where a kid like me in the 1930s from a progressive background could be playing cowboys and Indians.
Mm,
Okay. That took real indoctrination for centuries.
mm,
Finally, it's possible to break through. It's very hard work. As I say, I have to do it right now, but
mm,
it can be done. With intensive work, can be done. So my own university here at the University of Arizona has Native American studies uh, honored, respected, uh, appointments on the faculty, work with the local indigenous communities. Very positive developments. That's at MIT where I taught for 60 years. Happened to have a major center of indigenous studies. Started by this man I mentioned, Ken Hale, who was working not just, by now there are studies with Southwest Indians who were Navajo, Hopi, he brought to MIT to try to get them through a graduate school education, even though many of them had never had much of an educational background, but worked hard. They did wonderful work, got their doctoral degrees, often on their own languages, went back home, started educational centers, cultural centers, which have been very effective, not only in reviving the language, but the whole cultural tradition. And faculty from MIT go up and back to participate in these in summer sessions and so on. So there's a lot that can be done, and it can be done very effectively.
Yeah, so that kind of goes against that sort of media campaign against us that we're one dimensional, we're angry, we're the warrior. Representations is what I'm getting at. So there's work to be done through indigenous intellectualism to kind of defeat that. Yeah. That's,
Yeah, and by now there are a fair number of indigenous scholars doing advanced work,
mhm,
some of the best work, in fact. So that, and that, in the reservations, the educational circumstances are pretty poor,
mhm,
but more resources can go into that, and it can come from the people themselves working in cooperation with major educational centers like MIT, University of Arizona, others, Yale. So I think this kind of cooperation can be very effective in breaking barriers. By now, among younger students, I think the consciousness is pretty high, radically different from what it was a couple of decades ago. It's
mhm,
kind of like Black consciousness. If you take, say, the George Floyd murder, it's pretty remarkable what happened. Uh, Within days, uh, there was the development of actually the largest social movement in American history by far. A lot of solidarity, black and white, working together, enormous popular support, had about 2/3 popular support. It's way above what Martin Luther King did at the peak of his popularity. It's all the result of years and years of organizing and activism, often led by Black activists, those who formed Black Lives Matter and many others. It goes back to the 1960s, SNCC, Panthers, others, all broke barriers and opened up possibilities to finally face the fact that the wealth and power of the United States rests on the most vicious system of slavery that ever existed in human history. That's why the United States is a rich country. In the 19th century, 18th, 19th century, cotton was the fuel of the economy. Cheap cotton was gained by vicious torture and massacre. That's how you had cheap cotton. That's the basis for U.S. manufacturing. Began with textiles, finance, trade, commerce, England as well. That's why England became a rich country. France, about 20% of French wealth probably came from the hideous slavery system in Haiti, all over. Finally beginning to be understood. Like with the indigenous, extermination, it's taken centuries, but it's finally breaking through. And that's all to the good.
Yeah, a lot of people tend to think Indigenous people are invisible. That's a consciousness in Canada. A lot of times they'll find out I'm Indigenous and say, well, I didn't think there was Indigenous people left. There was work at eraser of our culture, you know. So it's good to hear things are turning in the zeitgeist and we're finally uh, acknowledging the past and the past atrocities and then unpacking that as a nation. And
Acknowledging and sometimes doing something about it. Of course, we shouldn't overlook the fact that there's a huge backlash. That's a large part of what the November election was about in the United States.
Right.
Go to rural America, they don't want to hear about it. They're white supremacists. They don't want to hear about minorities, indigenous people, black people, all of this. They want to crush. In fact, racism in the United States has actually, in many ways, increased along with the increased consciousness and recognition of past crimes. They kind of go in parallel. People, rural communities were, conservative, Christian, evangelical. They don't want their traditional way of life disturbed. Their traditional way of life meant they had a jackboot on somebody's neck. That's called real red-blooded American. We don't want that disturbed. We want our kids to play cowboys and Indians, and we want blacks to be in their place. That's enough of America so that the country split.
We had that here with our treaty rights. The Mi'kmaq people have unceded lands, and we have treaties with the Crown that actually came from Boston pre-Canada, and then later were inherited with the Constitution. But it said the land was unceded. We had a right to moderate livelihood fishery. And so we went and expressed that right. Our fisher people went out and fished, and there was a huge backlash. And they said, we got to negotiate this. But we said, hey, wait, we already negotiated this in Boston pre-Canada. But overt racism, sometimes I'm scared as an Indigenous person who holds a public place in Halifax here, Dubuque, to even go out because there's so much overt racism on talk radio. People are speaking out. Why are they taking our rights? And they seem to have that consciousness that they won some kind of war, but we negotiate a peace treaty and moving forward in peace and friendship. So you mentioned that, and it really resonates in Canada too, that there's a lot of backlash when it comes to rights and unpacking the past.
Well, in some ways, you're lucky to be north of the border. The United States, as you know, tried to conquer Canada many times. Once during the American Revolution, a couple of later times. They were beaten back by British force. But if they'd succeeded, it would have been much worse. The record.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions, and thanks again. This is a very stimulating conversation. I'm thinking about decolonization, activism. What can students do? Say I'm a student starting out. What could I do to make sure I'm engaged with democracy, I guess, you speak of the minority, the opulent, and how deeply they protect their power. I'm wondering, what can the average person do, or form a collective, or.
Well, if you look back over history, you find that students have very often been in the forefront of activist groups. Take just recent history, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement.
Mhm,
Uh, it kind of peaked. The leading forces in the Civil Rights Movement were SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like early 60s. They were the ones organizing the freedom buses, driving through the South, trying to encourage Black farmers to dare to cast a vote. Vicious environment, lynchings, killings, all kinds of things. They kept it going. They basically laid the basis for the civil rights movement. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It's been that way all along. The activism of the 60s was spearheaded by students. Right now, take climate change. The climate strike is students. It runs right through history, and there's a good reason for it. Students may not recognize it, but they're at the time of their life when they're most free.
mhm,
They're just out of parental control. They're not yet in a situation where they got to find a way to put food on the table for their families. It's a period of freedom that's unusual. So that's what education ought to be,
mhm,
using this period of freedom to explore, to think, to challenge, to create, and to act. And a lot of ways of acting. Uh, Young kids from the Sunrise Movement in the United States sat in on congressional offices, got a little support from some of the leftish representatives who came in on the Sanders wave,
mhm,
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez primarily. And they were able to put the Green New Deal on the legislative agenda. Long way to go, but some kind of Green New Deal has to be enacted if we're going to survive. It's a matter of literal survival. And incidentally, throughout the world, the First Nations, indigenous people in uh, Latin America, Australia, Africa have been at the forefront of doing something to save the environment from total destruction. They've been in the lead, and students are very much involved. So people like you are in a perfect position.
mhm,
Right? The two main groups that have been in the forefront of the struggle to try to save the world and organize human society from the destructiveness of Western industrial capitalism, which is going to destroy it. And these are the forces that can protect it. It's a historic responsibility, and it's a indigenous people and students are in the forefront, as they've often been in the past. Well, what can you do? Just about anything. We live in pretty free societies, fortunately. You don't get sent to torture chambers. You can get denounced, condemned, lose your job, things like
mhm.
that. But by comparative and historical standards, it's pretty free. So that means lots of opportunities.
That's very powerful. Thank you. As one final question, I'm thinking about data sovereignty and how that's important to indigenous groups. Uh,
How?
Data sovereignty. I'm thinking a lot of times we protect our data and our data systems and don't share them necessarily with academia because of that fear of being kind of sucked up in the cosmopolitan. Like, I'm wondering how we can negotiate sharing our stories and cultural memory, but at the same time not getting like totally enveloped by the systems.
That's part of a much larger problem. If you have a cell phone, you're being tracked constantly
Right.
by big tech. They're collecting data about you every time you move. If you
Mhm.
drive a car, all kind of electronic equipment, It's gone straight back to the car manufacturers selling it off to commercial uh, enterprises. So when we get to the Internet of Things pretty soon, so your refrigerator has some electronic device in it, it'll be picking up data about you, what you're doing, who you're talking to. Huge amounts of data are being sucked up to provide uh, profits for commercial enterprises and means of control.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to become means of controlling your behavior, directing it in particular directions, being used for the workforce now. It's simply to control them. If you're a driver for UPS, you're being monitored every second from your truck. If you stop too long for a cup of coffee, you get a warning.
Mm-hmm.
If you back up when you weren't supposed to back up, you get a warning. UPS claims that they've made the system much more efficient by this constant surveillance. They have fewer drivers, more deliveries. People work like maniacs, to try to maintain themselves within this surveillance system. That's what we're working to generally. What you're talking about is a special case of it. How do you preserve the culture and the society? Well, I think it could be done. In fact, you can institute cultural studies programs within the local schools, high schools, elementary schools, colleges, centers where the indigenous cultures are not only presented, but cherished, learned. Kids can participate in them. You can essentially move into the society, influence it, take it over on your terms. This is a central part of the history of our society and its culture. We should honor, respect it, participate in it. And it's true, you have to fight off the forces you're describing, but it's not an impossibility. They don't have a gun to your heads. There's pressures, there's threats. As you said, you feel threatened. Yes, that's true, but it can be done. I mean, let me just give you another anecdote from personal history. I'm Jewish. In the 1930s, when I was growing up, we happened to be the only Jewish family in a mostly Irish and German Catholic neighborhood. Bitterly anti-Semitic, pro-Hitler, you know. The Irish, because they hated Britain, the Germans, because they liked Germany. There were streets I couldn't walk down because I was afraid of those tough Irish kids. It wasn't like now. They didn't have guns and no guns and knives and that sort of thing, but it was pretty unpleasant for a teenage kid. That's gone. When I got to Harvard, early 1950s, supposedly the peak of Western civilization, the anti-Semitism was so extreme you could cut it with a knife. Practically no Jewish faculty, even in fields that were like mathematics, that were half Jewish. There were all kinds of things going on that I didn't understand. People in clubs and this and that and the other thing, which of course I couldn't get near being Jewish, and I didn't care anyway, so it didn't matter. But the point it went on for a long time. Places like Princeton into the 60s and the 70s. By now it's finally gone, so that's pretty much finished. It can, and of course that's nothing as severe as the racism against. I'll just give you another example. 1924, the United States passed its first immigration law. There had been laws barring Chinese. That had existed. But Europeans were free to come. In fact, they needed them to replace the population they were exterminating. So there was a huge European immigration. It was pretty free. 1924, a law was passed aimed at Italians and Jews. They didn't use those words. What they said was Southern and Eastern Europeans. That meant Italians and Jews. We don't want the wops and the kikes. Okay. That lasted until the 60s. Now, they don't talk about it in the United States, but that's a large reason for why the Holocaust wiped out the Jewish population. people couldn't come here.
Mhm.
They were blocked. Okay? That's not ancient history. And it's not a pretty story. It's my family, for example, extended family wiped out in the Holocaust.
Mhm.
They try to come to the United States, impossible. They allowed a few people like Einstein, some others came, but just fringe of the elite. Even after the war, Second World War, there were still Jews dying in concentration camps. They would have done anything they could to try to come to the United States.
Mhm.
Blocked. Actually, they were forced to go to Palestine to be cannon fodder for the coming war. Not their choice, not the United States. That's pretty recent and pretty serious. Well, finally ended. But the kind of struggle you're talking about is a large part and a very ugly part of human history. And you got to struggle against it constantly. And you can have victories, late, slow, but they come.
Wow. Thank you, sir. This has been very empowering for our students. This very good medicine to hear. I want to thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Very good to talk to you. And good luck with what you're doing. Really
Thank you.
important.
See you.